Drake, we talk a lot about the Big 12 and the respect it gets, and some of that is crafted like in the national narrative. Now, I understand the SEC is the greatest, and the Big 10's won the last couple, and the ACC has the whatever. A lot of people like to crap on the Big 12, but I think even when they're not, like the sin of omission is sometimes worse than the sin of commission, right? Like, and leaving the Big 12 out of things is maybe a slight as well. Pete Nakos dropped a top 10 out of conference, non-conference game list. And maybe unsurprisingly, what are your thoughts on this? The ACC's on it a few times. The Big 12, nowhere to be found in Nakos' list. Now, I like Pete Nakos. This is an attack on him. I think he does great work with the portal and NIL. But the Big 12's not even a second thought, not an afterthought. They're just not even a thought at all here.
Yeah, I think step one in truly burying the Big 12 or the ACC or anybody is forgetting about them. You know, I mean, if you erase the Big 12 from history or erase the depth, the breadth of the conference right now and the impact that we have on college football, then it's much easier to say we didn't need them in the first place. It's much easier to say, hey, the ACC without Clemson and Florida State is a conference that does not matter. We forget the legendary years of Doug Flutie at Boston College. We forget that, hey, guess what? Miami was really good 2 decades ago, and they could carry a conference if they rise back to prominence. We forget some of these legendary moments in NC State or Georgia Tech's history, all because if we erase that history, we can get closer and closer to erasing the conference. And the Big 12 is seeing that right now in examples like this. And TJ, you even texted beforehand and said, how do you forget UNC TCU? How do you leave that off? How are we not talking about that as one of the biggest games in the or Baylor and Auburn, where the Bears playing at home will likely be favored against an SEC opponent, namely with Sawyer Robertson and so many returners in Waco? How do we leave those off? Bill Belichick, in his first game as a collegiate head coach, doesn't make Nakos' list. That does not make any sense to me. And you're right. At some level, much of this is pointed. And maybe the pointed part of it is the Big 12 doesn't make money for ESPN to talk about. They don't make money for Fox to talk about as much as the SEC or the Big 10. They don't drum up. You said this to me off the air. You made a joke about the SEC having the most teams eliminated in weekend one of the regionals in college baseball. Your DMs are flooded. Your responses are flooded. Had you said the same thing, the Big 12 loses 75% of teams in weekend one regionals, you think your DMs are flooded? You think this drives traffic, and controversy is the number one news value. And the controversy of pitting, Texas and Ohio State above Clemson and South Carolina, or Clemson and South Carolina above LSU and Clemson, that is going to spark people's attention, perk their ears up much more than just simply leaving off Colorado and Georgia Tech, who, by the way, the Buffs are the number one bell cow when it comes to media exposure the Big 12 gets. And yet still on Pete Nakos' list, Deion Sanders couldn't buy a spot.
There are some great matchups on this. And I'll admit, I think one is right. I think the Texas-Ohio State game is the game that I'm most looking forward to out of conference this year. I got no problems with that. Alabama-Florida State, very intriguing to me, and I think nationally, to see how Florida State potentially bounces back, what Alabama looks like in year 2 under DeBoer. There are some other ones. The LSU-Clemson game is a game that I am ecstatic about. Like that, just that matchup is so cool. I think that's a ton of fun. I think the idea of the battle for Death Valley, Brian Kelly 0-5 in SEC area. I'm sorry, LSU 0-5, Brian Kelly 0-3, starting out seasons over the last 5 years. That is a huge dynamic. Has Clemson bounced back? They went 0-2 against the SEC last year. There are some real dynamic games on here, right? Like there are some things that are just no doubters. And listen, I think we would even be fair and say, yeah, the SEC and the Big 10, they do have more fun out of conference matchups than the other two conferences. I think that's easy to admit. That's fine to admit. But then you look at some of these games. Duke and Illinois? Is Duke and Illinois a game? Like, so I think the TCU UNC one is very intriguing, and Belichick's carrying a lot of the weight there. No offense to the Horned Frog fans. We have a few that watch, and we appreciate you a ton. Belichick's carrying a lot of weight there. Auburn Baylor is one of my top 5 out of conference games in all of college football. Like that is one where Hugh Freeze has to figure it out. Like they can't lose on the road at Baylor. and then think they're going to compete week in and week out in that SEC schedule, which we have both admitted on here. Yeah, the SEC, they do have a lot of great teams, top to bottom. Like, we get it. I think we give them their due diligence. Now, do we maybe get upset with the coverage and the fans and things like that? Sure. But the SEC is really good. That Baylor, and then same thing for the Baylor side. If they win that game to open up the year against an SEC opponent, what does the rest of their schedule look like? Like the hype around that game and the way that Baylor finished last season and the way that Auburn has to rebound and Hugh Freeze's seat is certainly warming up. That's one of the top games. So again, Georgia Tech and their kind of resurgence under Key, Colorado rebounding from no Hunter or Sanders. Yeah, there's a lot of intrigue, a lot of games. It shocks me that somehow, if you just look at his 10th game, somehow Duke and Illinois, which I know Illinois had a good year last year. I know Duke had a good year last year. They've replaced the entire team with the portal. But nonetheless, Duke and Illinois somehow made. I'm not asking for Baylor and Auburn to be one. I think that's foolish. If you're a Baylor fan or Auburn fan, maybe you think it's one, but like I think we can all agree Texas Ohio State certainly deserves it. I'm not even asking for it to be 2 or 3. But the fact that Baylor Auburn didn't, an SEC team, like you're getting the benefit of an SEC team. Instead, you picked a Big Ten team and an ACC team in Duke to be on this, but not Baylor Auburn for some reason. That's where I'd probably have the biggest complaint on this. Listen, if you don't, maybe TCU doesn't measure up. UNC does because of Belichick. Okay, if you want to leave that off, that's fine. Hunter and Sanders aren't there. You want to leave Colorado off? Okay, I'll buy that. Baylor Auburn not being on here is a huge issue to me.
I think so. And TJ, further than just forgetting the Big 12 or forgetting Big 12 matchups or games that Big 12 teams are in, I think we're once again overvaluing big brands. Michigan, Oklahoma. They both sucked last year. Like that, yeah, if that's a top 5 game for you, I find it much more consequential knowing that Baylor and Auburn are both fighting for a college football playoff spot in week 1. That's what this is. If Baylor loses, you're not going to the college football playoff unless you win your conference, very likely. If Auburn loses, your season's done. If Michigan loses, if Oklahoma loses, they probably weren't going to go to the college football playoff anyway, based on how the cards are stacked against them. And across Texas, Ohio State, even Clemson, South Carolina, you could argue that all 4 of those teams are good enough that, if you lose that game, you're probably still going to the college football playoff. I think Texas and Ohio State are pretty much a shoo-in at this point, and we haven't played a game just based on narratives. Of course they're a shoo-in, and I think Clemson is certainly in that category. South Carolina will likely find itself there. LSU thinks it has the roster talent to do so. So if we're talking about consequential games in the early season, Baylor Auburn has to be up there. Colorado, Georgia Tech has to be. We're looking at a Georgia Tech team that could be a dark horse for the college football playoff and to win the ACC. A Colorado school who's without one of the best quarterbacks in college football as well as the Heisman Trophy winner. Each of those teams is in a must-win situation. TCU, North Carolina, must-win situation. Belichick loses, already hot seat conversations because of the girlfriend deal. TCU loses, already hot seat conversations because of the decline after the national championship for Sonny Dykes. That goes so much further to me than a game between 2 teams that we pretty much know are already going to be in the playoff or pretty much irrelevant based on their scenarios. I think Oklahoma and Michigan will both end up looking outside looking in of the playoff based on what they have to deal with in Big 12, in Big 10 and SEC play. I don't know why we can't include a Baylor Auburn matchup where it is do or die this early in the year.